Welcome everyone. I'm the LSC director of the Symposium, and this is actually only the second year that we're running this event. And this year it's a collaboration between the International Development Societies of LSE, SOAS, and UCL. We're also sponsored by Chemonics International, with whom we're organizing a workshop on Friday. So yeah, just wanted to say that the organizing team and I are very proud to present you with this event. We've been working on this like the past couple of months, and it's been like quite difficult during COVID. And we wish we could have welcomed you all like on campus, but like this is how it is now. And like as Alan said, that means we have speakers and attendees from all over the world. So we're very excited about this. And like also a special thanks to Milena who put this panel together. And yeah, we hope you enjoy it and that we can all see you in person next year, hopefully for a third symposium that will this time be in person.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Omilola. That's great. Yes, indeed, it's not in person, but indeed it means that we have participants from all over the world. So that's also actually quite exciting. So I really hope that we're sort of here together to learn and to improve our understanding and see how we can move forward on these just very important issues. So great if you can put any comments, questions in the chat. We try to raise them to the panelists, or otherwise there's also room to discuss amongst each other, have a discussion in the chat. But hopefully we get to raise a lot of questions to the panelists. First, we have the panelists all present for 10 to 15 minutes each. Then I will raise a question, or maybe I'll pick up on some questions that are raised by the audience, and then we continue in a Q&A. So hopefully it's going to be a very productive evening with a lot of new insights. So let's quickly start. So Nehmat, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ellen. And I'm sure it's going to be a really interesting discussion. I'm going to dive right in and maybe sort of start by introducing myself. When I was graduating from LSE, 12 years ago, this is not where I expected to kind of end up, working in the field of climate policy and much less speaking at my alma mater. So first, thank you for having me back. I found myself working in this field mainly by a stroke of positive variance, what you call luck, and have found myself learning new things every day for the past 12 years. That is my privilege, and hopefully yours too today. I would be what you call a generalist in this field, so I'm also honored to be speaking with my fellow panelists who are all experts in this area, and so I also hope I'm able to do justice to what I'm contributing today through my experiences. I also want to kind of echo and say this is a very interesting time to be talking about this issue about green transition and sustainable development. It's a really interesting time in climate multilateralism overall, and has been for the last 10 years, when the conversation on renewable energy, climate change, linking development with green has been taking hold more and more. And when you kind of juxtapose that with what's happening in global economies, the 2008 crisis, what's happening right now due to COVID-19, the various kind of highs and lows that we've seen, it really becomes super interesting. So I'm going to dive right into it. So the key words for this session, of course, when I was starting to think about what I was going to say, I was also looking at what the buzzwords are. It's green transition, sustainability, development. And I'm an optimist, so I also kind of love these words in some sense because they're rooted in concepts of change, of the past being different from what we're imagining the future to be, and not just the human race kind of thinking about survival, but we're now thinking about prosperity coming together with climate action. So it's a lot about thriving in this current context, which is why I feel very, very positive about it. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's loads to improve from where we are. And I think that's the opportunity I'm happy about, that I think for the first time as humanity, as countries coming together, we're collectively thinking about how prosperity can link with, while we're addressing this undeniable externality called climate change. And like I said, there's broad consensus, not just from countries, which were the traditional stakeholders in the decision-making on climate change, but also other agents that are doing what needs to be done in their own context, their own decision-making jurisdictions. So businesses, investors, cities, states, provinces, schools, universities, you name it. And they're there, they're recognizing their own agency and making decisions how to play their own part in addressing climate change, right? So the movement has seen sort of a significant groundswell, and that's what's so exciting. Markets are shifting towards electrification from traditional fossil fuels, not because suddenly companies that manufacture cars and buses have developed a conscience, but because now it's profitable to offer products that are cheaper for consumers to run, operate, and use. Although there is something there too. Have companies developed a conscience? I mean, I remember doing my LSE master's thesis on something called corporate social responsibility. And that's why I say I got to work in this area at a very interesting time, because 12 years ago, companies were kind of engaging with the development sector through CSR, through corporate social responsibility. But I feel like that has shifted, and that now, you know, the demand and supply of climate neutral products is more and more a business decision in markets today. And I think that's a really interesting departure from kind of where we were initially. So let's talk a little bit about what led to this change, and you know, we can talk about how far that dates. But I guess there are two ways to talk about the issue. There's one part which is sustaining natural ecosystems, nature, natural resources, stuff that exists on planet Earth, and sustaining its quality, its abundance, and do not disturb the role that it plays in sustaining humanity. And I think that's where the conversation on fossil fuels, etc., comes in. And the second part is sustaining planetary conditions to support life, temperatures, atmosphere, weather patterns, extreme heat, cold, controlling emissions. And my line of work kind of pertains more to the second part, which is climate policy, climate, you know, sort of decision making, although they are very closely related and, you know, sort of deeply connected. And of course, how politics plays into this entire conversation, and the balance of power, like any other development issue, comes into both these issues of environmental conservation and climate change as well. But it's interesting to note, I mean, where we are in the modern conversation on climate policy and climate action didn't actually happen till the late 80s. In the early 80s, there was one big success of countries coming together to protect the ozone layer, which was through the Montreal Protocol. And, you know, it was only after that, and after the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was created in the late 80s, that we actually started talking about emissions control and thinking about kind of where temperature rise was threatening, you know, sort of humanity, so to speak. So once the first IPCC assessment report came out in the 1990s, the fun really began. The first Earth Summit was held. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was opened up to countries for signatures. The United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification opened up. And come 1997, countries negotiated the Kyoto Protocol. This is just some background that I'm giving for context. And the Kyoto Protocol was an amendment to the UNFCCC. Countries that ratified the Kyoto Protocol for the very first time committed to reducing their emissions of carbon dioxide and 5 other greenhouse gases. It basically bound 38 industrialized countries to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by an average of 5.2% below 1990 levels between 2008 and 2012. And, you know, it was then sort of that conversation became the question of, you know, in the 2000s, what do we want to achieve? We know that, you know, leaders of countries gathered at the UN headquarters signed the Millennium Declaration, which led to the Millennium Development Goals up until 2015, which ultimately then became the Sustainable Development Goals to be applicable and achieved between 2015 and 2030. So 2015, I feel like was a watershed year. It was a year where, you know, it was key for multilateralism across different issues. But for us, the climate community, the biggest achievement was the Paris Agreement on climate change. Its goal was to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees C, preferably 1.5 degrees C. And obviously the latest IPCC assessment has said it has to be 1.5 degree, given that the action that the countries have taken has not been enough. And to achieve this long-term temperature goal, countries basically aim to reach global peaking of greenhouse gas emissions. Once you peak, then you can start reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. So they aimed peaking GHG emissions as soon as possible and achieve a climate neutral world by 2050. And I, you know, with that kind of preface and with that history, I also wanted to talk about where politics comes in. right? International power dynamics played into the climate change negotiations as well. In the early 90s, countries, started to acknowledge that there is obviously developing countries and developed countries, and the concept of common but differentiated responsibility was formalized. This is called Cbdr. So Cbdr principle acknowledges that all countries have shared obligation to address the environmental destruction, but it denies equal responsibility of all states with regard to environmental protection. In plain English, this means that the onus of combating climate change and its adverse effects mainly rested with the advanced and developed economies, such as, the United States, countries in the EU, and so on and so forth. They have been the historical high emitters for the reference of our listeners today. But you also have development that's happening in developing countries today, India, China, with large populations. And of course, there is the pace of development is extremely rapid, which means that also leads to a significant threat that if emissions are not controlled while these countries are developing, that the problem that we're trying to address would only become worse. And the opposition, of course, from the Indias and Chinas of the world has been that, when industrialized countries were hoping to develop, they were emitting carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions, but curbing those emissions today would actually be curbing their development, their economic development. And that's the kind of question that you alluded to, Ellen, which is, at play here today. So there's good news. I feel like there's positive news in that markets and technologies today are shifting rapidly towards emissions in a low emission future, investment in a low emission future. And this shift is obviously key for several reasons, but the biggest indication it's providing is that there is increasing evidence that this shift in markets is highly profitable and is pro-development. What I'm essentially saying is that countries like India and China, which are at the stage of development, can see a lot of prosperity and profitability and invest in a low carbon future at the same time. I'm going to give kind of two quick examples to make my point. Let's see, in October 2020, the International Energy Agency confirms that the world's best solar power schemes now offer, and I quote, the cheapest electricity in history with the technology which is now cheaper than coal and gas in major countries, right? And same year, in July 2020, an insurance company in the UK did a study which showed that over its lifetime, an EV ownership, life cycle cost is lower than the life cycle cost of an internal combustion engine automobile. You combine those two and you have a zero emission automobile sector, which essentially is providing cheaper cost for everyone who's using it. So what does this mean for markets and the way in which we are producing and consuming things? Or what does this mean for businesses now? And I also want to acknowledge that it took us a lot of time and significant work to get to this stage, but all the trends are pointing in the right direction. And lots of things are happening now, which are super positive, right? Investors are divesting from fossil fuels. Businesses are committing to science-based targets, 1,200 companies across the world. The Apples, Accentures, AstraZeneca, right? Everybody knows AstraZeneca because of the vaccine. AstraZeneca, BMW, Google, Microsoft, they're all committed to 100% renewable energy. They're all committed to kind of switching their vehicles and how they operate to EVs. So all of these are trends in the right direction. And, you could ask yourself why they are doing it. They would only do it if it made business sense and if it made kind of sense for profit making. And the way in which I kind of see this translating into positive development and where it plays in trickle-down economics is basically through job creation and through kind of stronger systems on public health. If you address the sources of emissions, you're also addressing air pollution, water pollution, and therefore making communities more sustainable, more resilient, and healthier and more productive in the future. And what I'm going to bring this back now to today, what COVID-19 has done. It has done two things. One, it has shown us that if the world puts its head together and decides, it can basically solve a major challenge like a global pandemic, which stopped everybody in their work. So even around climate change, if there is, support that comes together and commits to addressing climate change as an issue, we will be able to solve that issue. And the second thing it has done is it has shown us how through all this digitalization, we can actually reduce the emissions. I mean, we have people dialing in from across the world without actually emitting the aviation emissions that they would have done if they would have traveled to London to attend this in person, right? So there are ways in which the human race can be innovative. So I'm going to stop there, and I really look forward to the discussions and listening to the other panelists. Thanks, Ellen.
Thank you so much, Nehmat, for laying out all the history and giving your excellent points. Very, very interesting and inspiring, and also very optimistic. So that's a very nice start of our evening. So let's move on now to Babatunde Omilola from the United Nations Development Program.
Thank you very much, Ellen, for the introduction. I'm delighted to be here to join the distinguished panelists to address the London Development Symposium this evening. Let me say from the outset that I will be speaking on behalf of myself. So most of what I would say will be my own personal reflections of where we are. Having said that, let me also mention that precisely because we want to avoid any kind of dichotomy or distinction between sustainability and development, was why world leaders came up with Sustainable Development Goals and adopted them, the 17 of them, in 2015. So I will be talking to the audience today about these Sustainable Development Goals and why we must integrate the social, economic, and environmental dimensions of sustainable development to be able to have the kind of world that we should all live in. As you all know, by 2050, the population of the world is going to be around 10 billion. So the question is, which kind of world do we want to live in? How would our world look like between now and 2030, the end year for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals? So 2015 was a remarkable year in the history of the world. It was a year when in July 2015, world leaders met in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and discussed around financing for development, what should happen in terms of where resources would come from, domestic resource mobilization, but also in terms of looking for different sources of financing, private sector and the rest. And of course, in 2015, in September, the world leaders adopted the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And in December of that same year, world leaders met in Paris and approved what we now call the Paris Accord in terms of climate change for the world. So bringing all of these elements together would help us to achieve sustainable development in the world. So the ambition in terms of the scope, the framework embodied by the Sustainable Development Goals actually reflect a paradigm shift in the global conception and means of responding to today's most pressing development challenges. And of course, all of these mirror the complexity of the globalized world that we live in terms of the interdependencies across many of the dimensions of the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 of them, starting from no poverty, that's SDG 1, no hunger, SDG 2, dealing with health, which is SDG 3, dealing with education, SDG 4, dealing with SDG 5, gender equality, SDG 6, water and sanitation, SDG 7 on energy access for people around the world, SDG 8 on issues around growth and decent work, SDG 9 on industry, innovation and infrastructure, SDG 10 on reducing inequalities around the world, SDG 12 on sustainable cities and community, on sustainable consumption and production around the world, SDG 12, and then SDG 13 on climate action, SDG 14 on life below water, SDG 15 on life on land, and then you come to SDG 16 around peace, justice, and institutions. And then SDG 17 to look for partnerships in terms of all of these goals could be met. So all of these goals, when you look at them, They show us the ever-evolving challenges of sustainability in all its dimensions across the world in terms of the policy frameworks, the institutional context for implementation, as well as what we need to do for people, for the planet that we all live in, for prosperity, for peace. And so today I want to touch upon 6 different areas where we can actually achieve sustainable development, that we can support countries around the world to achieve all of this sustainable development in a way that we will have, we will be catering for people, for the planet, for prosperity, and for peace. And the first area that I want to talk about is in terms of alignment. And by that, I mean, where you can have the national development plans of countries are well aligned with the SDGs themselves, so that the priorities are clear in terms of what different countries should do. And remember, the sustainable development goals are for the whole world. They are not just about goals for developing countries. Unlike in the past, when we had the Millennium Development Goals that were about the developing countries, 8 of them. Now, the Sustainable Development Goals, they are goals for the entire world, you know, for the whole global community to meet. So the first thing to be done, if you really want to achieve sustainability in all the dimensions, in terms of social, economic, and environmental dimensions of sustainable development, then alignment of those goals with national priorities is number 1 thing to be done. And this can be done in many ways. You know, within the UNDP, we came up with what we call rapid integrated assessment, whereby we look at the interlinkages across the different goals and targets in different national development plans, as well as the ones in the SDGs. And that work took us to many parts of the world. Personally, I was with a team in Tajikistan, in Sudan, and many other places to help them do that kind of alignment. That's number 1 thing to be done. The number 2 thing to be done is in terms of how we foster multi-stakeholder institutional arrangements and coordination to be able to support countries to meet these SDGs. This is important because in the past, governments tend to be the only actors that are there trying to make these things work, especially during the MDG era. Now, during this SDG era, the key issue is that we have to apply multi-stakeholder partnerships. Governments have to be there, private sector has to be there, multilateral development banks have to be there, civil society has to be there, academia, think tanks, and all relevant stakeholders at any part, in any part of the world. So this is very critical. The third aspect that I think it's also very useful, it's in terms of acceleration of the SDGs. Since I have given you what these SDGs are, there are 17 of them. To really meet them, many countries, they do not have equal amount of resources, whether financial resources, human resources, technical resources that they can deploy to meet all of these SDGs. Then they would have to prioritize certain accelerators. And those accelerators might differ from countries to countries. What those accelerators will do will be to provide the catalytic effects that can help countries to meet many SDGs at the same time, that can give that broad overview. For instance, when we were when I was in Sudan with my colleagues, with my team, in terms of the kind of accelerators that they need to come up with in Sudan. The key accelerator that came to mind was gender equality and empowerment of girls and women, that if the country were to do that, they are likely going to achieve catalytic effects across many other goals, whether the economic dimensions in terms of growth for the country, or whether the social dimensions on health, on education, social protection, and the rest of them. So prioritizing certain accelerators is extremely important. In some countries, it might be prioritizing climate action, for instance, that can help them, especially countries that are very vulnerable to weather shocks in many parts of the world, whether you are talking about small island development states, or you are talking about Indian ocean states. So all of these very vital. So prioritizing accelerators. The fourth element in terms of how we can actually achieve sustainable development around the world is looking for the financing. Where will the resources come from? This is extremely important because when we did our estimates, we realized that globally we are going to need $2.5 trillion every year between now and 2030 if we are to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So where will the resources come from? So financing is a key element, and this financing, we cannot leave it to official development assistance for developing countries, but we also have to look for domestic resource mobilization mechanisms whereby we can generate more resources to support in the kinds of investment that are needed to achieve sustainable development, whether it's in terms of energy access or in terms of combating climate change or in terms of dealing with other dimensions of sustainable development. So financing is key. The fifth element, I think, which is also very critical, is that even though we tend to pretend that we know so much now, we still lack sufficient evidence in terms of what is going on and how the world can really achieve most of the Sustainable Development Goals, if not all of them, by 2030. So data, monitoring, reporting are extremely important to gather those kind of evidence. And the evidence will differ from country to country, from region to region, and from community to community. And that's why the academia is extremely important here, can play a really critical role, the academia and think tanks, to come up with those innovative ideas, creative evidence that will show us where there are lagging SDGs or lagging countries that are really, really behind in terms of meeting the SDGs. Now, the sixth point that I want to mention in terms of what we could do globally, it's around advocacy and communication and partnerships. All of these elements are critical. Even though I've mentioned earlier on, multi-stakeholder partnerships are extremely important because different actors and different stakeholders have to talk to one another. We are now in a situation where economic agents can not only be talking to themselves, but they have to talk to environmentalists and social development experts as well. So it's that kind of integration that is needed. And for that to happen, we need to do more advocacy in terms of the impact of climate change, for instance, impact of energy access, in terms of the dimensions of what you can call some of the mega trends, whether it's about water, it's about energy, climate change, and all of that, and how they interrelate with what would happen in terms of global growth, global poverty reduction. So all of those elements are critical, as I've mentioned them. We are now in a world where COVID-19 came to the scene and unfortunately has devastated so many of our progress that we have made. Just yesterday, America recorded 500,000 people that have died as a result of COVID-19. This is, of course, very unfortunate and unacceptable in the world that we live in today. So now for us to achieve sustainable development, the way we know it, the way we crafted the Sustainable Development Goals when we did all our intergovernmental negotiations at that time, we would have to factor in other kinds of shocks that can come in. The COVID-19 pandemic, it's a big shock. Now, the global economy was said to have contracted by around 5.2% in 2020 as a result of COVID-19. So that it's a big issue. And COVID-19 pandemic has actually affected livelihoods. It has affected so many economies. It has caused many damages. Education in many parts of the world, especially in developing countries, has been affected. So now the idea is to factor in all of this as we'll address the different dimensions of sustainability, and to know that the COVID-19 pandemic is not just about health. It's about economy, it's about environment, it's about the social dimensions. And once we embed all of this with clear leadership at all levels, with clear innovation, with clear partnerships, then we'll be able to move in this new decade of action that we are in. This is 2021, and the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 of them, they're expected to be met by 2030. Let me conclude by saying that there is no distance. I mean, at this stage, we should not be talking about any dichotomy or distinction between sustainability and development. We are in an era where these are now being embedded, and we have a framework, a global framework for this, which are the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and we all have to rally around that so that we properly integrate the social, economic, and environmental dimensions of development to achieve sustainable development in our world as we move into the decade of action into 2030. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Babatunde. That was a great talk that you gave. Thank you very much. Let's move on to our third panelist of the evening, and that's Natalia Salazar.
Good evening, and thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation. I'm very honored to be here today to share with this panel with a group of experts on the topic of green transition, and to be able to discuss with all of you the trade-offs between sustainability and development. But before that, allow me to, before I begin, allow me to share my screen with you so that you are able actually to see my presentation, but I'm not very sure if I can do that yet, but in any case, I can just continue. Helen, up to you. Perfect, thank you very much. So I'll focus my intervention on the green transition, and I'll focus also on the where does the Latin America and the Caribbean region stand with regards to green transition. Is sustainability actually a solution to the current development challenges or not? And before I continue, I would like to say that I come from a LAC country, Ecuador, and this has allowed me to understand poverty from a personal perspective, as well as the development challenges my region and my country face, by having had the opportunity to work, to live, to study in Germany, in Norway, and in Austria, has not only helped me, but also has broadened my perspective on sustainability and development. And this has helped me nowadays in my day-to-day work across the LAC region. However, I have constantly asked myself whether there is actually a trade-off between sustainability and development. And here I would like to ask you, do you think actually there is such a trade-off? And let me picture you the following scenario. So you're having a dialogue with the government of the region, with the government authorities of one of the countries in the region, on the design of a project in the energy sector for power generation. The annual electricity demand is actually growing each year, and the currently electricity generation capacity is not able to meet this demand. And hence there's an urgency to develop this project. The country does not have an environmental legislation in place, and the GDP is $4 billion. There are two feasible variables, option A and option B. Option A, the generation will come from non-renewable sources. The total cost of the project would be approximately $100 million. The construction period would be 2 years, and the country has already 30 years of experience with this type of technologies. Now, option B, the generation will come from renewable sources. The total cost of the project will be estimated between $300 and $400 million. The construction period would be between 3 and 4 years, and the country has already 10 years of experience with this type of technologies. Now, my question is, which option is actually technically, socially, environmentally, and financially more feasible? This is an example of a common trade-off that many governments in the region face when attempting to solve development challenges. And there's a truth behind the fact that to prepare ourselves for the future, we need to reflect on the past. If we go back a couple of decades ago, we will be able to understand where the region stands. So during the 90s, the LAC region faced a recession, a political turmoil, and a rural to urban migration phenomenon. Later, during the 2000s, there was an economic recovery due to mainly the dynamics of foreign trade and investment and the commodities boom. We started to hear already about an increased globalization process. Governments began to also increase public spending, and policy reforms were aimed at poverty reduction. During the 2000 decade, there was a transition between the MDGs, so the Millennium Development Goals, to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. The Paris Agreement was signed, and governments in the LAC region started to promote an increased number of incentives for green investments. In a post-pandemic era, investments are actually catalyzed for the blue economy. That means local and regional economy. Public budget is being allocated to post-crisis recovery efforts. The COVID-19 pandemic also has brought increasing attention to regional development challenges. For instance, the need for joint procurement processes for medical supplies and equipment, the low access to education, and the low pace of digital transformation. And here I would like to mention that sustainability can not only be seen as a solution, but also as an opportunity. And for this, I will come back later. The LAC region faces several development challenges. It is well known that it is one of the most unequal regions in the world, mainly due to the access to basic services and economic distribution. The region is one of the most urbanized ones, and hence there are environmental challenges associated to it. For instance, waste management and deforestation. A limited economic diversification raises the question whether countries should continue subsidizing fossil fuels or promote increased incentives for green initiatives. The region accounts for over 5% of the world's emissions, and there are, of course, climate change action plans in place. Mexico, Chile, and Brazil are leading the way. However, the biggest challenge continues to be to eliminate poverty, as over 200 million people in the region live under these conditions. Although there have been improvements, for instance, there has been a relatively stable economy and political environment. If we compare to past decades, the private sector also has taken a key role and a really leading role in the economy. And governments have promoted policies to tackle poverty and equality. Still, most of the countries in the region have an export commodity dependence, which makes them vulnerable to global shocks. And there's also a need for skilled labor workforce to improve the labor market. So now my question is, what is the roadmap for a sustainable development agenda? The key lies on the national development plans, and that embrace actually the socio-economic development priorities of the countries under the integration of sustainable programs and projects. The LAC region is currently focusing, among others, on education and healthcare, digitalization and open data, transportation, water and sanitation, diversification of the energy matrix. Here is where I would like to explain our work at the OPEC Fund for International Development. We work with over 130 countries worldwide. We provide access to finance and capital mobilization. Today, we have committed over $25 billion towards the financing of around 4,000 projects in the region, in the world. A total of $3 billion has been allocated to the LAC region only, to finance nearly 300 projects. We invest in a wide range of sectors, including energy, transportation, healthcare, education, among others. But we also finance the emerging industries and on nature-based solutions, for instance, in the Caribbean. However, according to some statistics, annual investments in the region that are required in infrastructure range between $200 and $300 billion. Examples of recent projects that the OPEC Fund has financed are, for instance, a healthcare project in Dominica after the COVID-19 outbreak, the expansion of a wind farm in Honduras, rural roads in Bolivia, food security in Nicaragua, and the rehabilitation of the national electricity grid in the Dominican Republic, among others. There is also an emphasis nowadays on circular and blue economy and a strong focus on new business models and processes. However, to enable these investments in science and technology are required, which currently account for nearly 1% of the GDP of the region, which is actually quite low. This should come hand in hand with key policy measures. It is a fact that sustainability can be enabled through a digitalization process, not only by investing in infrastructure and technology, but also in knowledge. Innovation takes many forms, and we're talking about mostly the industry 4.0 technologies. And there are front runners already in this regard, particularly Colombia, Chile, and Uruguay. And it is also true that what works in one country does not necessarily work in another. We can take the lessons learned, the best practices, and the key success drivers, and this should help increase cooperation to scale up initiatives, maybe also green initiatives, and even pool additional financial and technical resources. For this purpose, the OPEC Fund has partnered with the World Bank, the UN agencies, and regional development banks. The current and future investments are beyond returns. We are seeing now a region that is more concerned with impact investing, with social responsibility, with environmental social governance, and governments that are pursuing an agenda on policy reforms and institutional changes. The green transition is not an automatic process, and we all know that. And sustainability will mostly depend on the adequate regional measures and on a regulatory framework to be in place. Finally, I would like to share a famous management quote from the father of management, Peter Drucker, which I believe that applies to various areas, including development. You can't manage what you can't measure. And measurement can happen in many ways and take many forms. Measurements should be applied as useful tools in the design of social programs and projects, and as instruments for geographic targeting for beneficiaries. Investment in sustainable infrastructure and renewable energy is central to economic recovery plans for many countries in the LAC region. And the COVID-19 pandemic has sped up these plans that intend to respond to sustainability and development. With this, I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very much looking forward to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Natalia Salazar. That was great to hear from your experience of working on the ground. We also have Peggy now with us. Apologies for the time confusion, and you're very welcome, Peggy, to be here. I introduced you that you work for JUICE, the joint US-China collaboration on clean energy, and that you sort of introduced China to the smart grid, which sounds like a great project, and you run many more interesting projects. So very much welcome here. Shame you missed out on the other presentations, and apologies for the confusion, but very happy you're here. So
that's my fault. It's always hard sometimes with the timeshare because the time zones. Do you see my picture?
Yes.
Okay, great, wonderful. This is actually a picture of me teaching the first class of Food Heroes, teaching young kids how to eat in a way that's good for you, but also good for the planet. So my journey as an environmentalist started in 2007 with the first ever public dialogues between US and Chinese government officials on clean energy. And this led to me starting JUICE, Joint US-China Collaboration on Clean Energy. So I'd like to today share with you a little bit about my theory of how to change the world. Because hopefully all of you who are listening today want to do exactly that by greening the world, by making the world a healthier place. And I want to share with you some of the remarkable insights that I've gained that I really didn't expect to learn. So first, let me give you a little bit of context. If you haven't heard of my organization over the last decade plus, we have been on a mission to green China. And when I first got started on this journey, one of my advisors said, you know, Peggy, people are going to tell you that this is an insurmountable challenge, but just ignore them. Another one said, Peggy, you're about to start on basically riding a tsunami. So your job is to stay on top of the crest and not fall under the water. And so that's essentially what I did. I've been very lucky in asking the right people to join the cause at the right time. And we have been able, since 2007, to bring in smart grid technologies. The entire term smart grid didn't exist in 2007. By 2009, almost 3 years later, we had the China state grid commit $7.2 billion US to implement smart grid across the country by 2020. That was last year. And now there are over 500 smart cities in China, or at least pilots, let me call it that way, pilot smart cities in China. And China is leading the way in implementing smart grid as well as manufacturing smart grid equipment. At the same time, we started the first ever classes on how to build eco-cities and taught them to mayors across China. And we've taught 1,000 mayors and central government officials how to build just that, eco-cities. And now China is the leader around the world in implementing sustainable technologies at city scale. A few years later, actually in 2007, that was the beginning of catalyzing the whole clean energy revolution. And I probably don't need to tell any of you in the audience that China is now the leader in producing clean energy as well as making clean energy equipment for the rest of the world. A couple of years later, we then took on the challenge to switch incandescent lighting to energy efficient lighting. Because in 2007, McKinsey had presented a waterfall chart at our first ever conference saying that lighting and heating and cooling were two of the first interventions that we should look at, ripple effects or acupressure points to improve energy efficiency in China. And now China is the leader not only in making all of the building codes eradicate incandescence, but they're also the leader in LEDs now. In 2010, I realized that after doing a lot of infrastructure work, that I needed to turn my attention to sustainable behavior, because sustainability is really the balance between energy supply and demand. But I realized, as somebody who was born and raised in America, that the environmental movement there had largely, I'm going to claim, failed. Because if you take a poll, if you look at the Pew polls, maybe 10% of the population say they care about going green. And 1% actually walks the talk. And so what have we been doing wrong? And that is what I set out to learn in 2010. And I traveled around the world to talk to behavior scientists, advertising agencies, people who worked on contraceptives in Catholic communities, how to get people to wear safety belts when they were first introduced. Many different people that were working on social impact. And I looked at what worked. And what I realized is that we have to really focus on the thing that changes human behavior, which is love. If you don't feel loved and you don't feel safe, ultimately you will not change behavior for the long term. Fear is a short-term phenomena. It's a short-term driver of short-term change. And nobody really changes based on guilt. The moral, imperative doesn't really work when it comes to living a sustainable lifestyle, as we, I believe, all know in this audience. And so what I discovered was, ironically, this entire time that I've been working on sustainability and talking about eco-cities and greening of China and PM 2.5 and statistics about different scenarios, what I learned was that I had to eradicate all of that from my language. And I had to instead use the vernacular of the culture of Chinese people's hearts. And that was that we are all on a journey together, from survivability to livability and then thrivability. And that is the China dream. And in 2012, Xi Jinping came into office to head the country, and his equivalent of State of the Union speech, he used this term China dream. And this has become the national slogan in murals, in subway ads, in commercials, all over the nation. In 2013, I realized as a board member of Drawdown, please take a look at drawdown.org for the first and really the only list of interventions that can help reverse climate change, not just to mitigate it. What I realized was that food is the secret to getting into people's hearts and making them fall in love with the environment, by falling in love with themselves and falling in love with making kids healthy, and that sharing food is sharing love, and that every part of nature can be reborn, and that we should be eating a rainbow every day. And that was the birth of Food Heroes. And Drawdown says that the top interventions of a very long list to reverse climate change is reducing food waste and to eat a plant-rich diet. And I realized at that point that not only did we need to eradicate the head language of sustainability and eco and climate and PM 2.5 and scenarios and such, we needed to speak to people's hearts, and we needed to use a Trojan horse. We needed to use something that didn't trigger people politically and didn't make people hide and run away, like the word climate change. Instead, we used food as a love language. And so that really, this journey, this context that I'm giving you, lays the ground for some of my biggest insights to how to change the world. And I'm giving them to you today so that hopefully I can empower you that in this moment, you decide to change the world because you can. I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes first. The Cliff Notes to changing the world is what we did over and over again. And I didn't mention the Green Bonds Initiative, but you sort of get my point. We've changed China many times over and therefore changed the world many times over. Each time, what we did was start with the picture of what the world looked like if we were already successful. We drew a picture of what Smart Grid looked like and how it would benefit China and what the first few steps would be. That was the first thing that we did in a white paper, and we took it around, knocked on people's doors. In our Eco Cities training for mayors, we did 15-minute videos of Kaikoura in New Zealand on eco-heritage tourism, or public parks in Bryant Park, New York City. And we showed mayors what could be, how beautiful life could be, how joyous it could be. And we made them yearn for the same things in their city. In clean energy, same thing. We not only did we show what could be, but we put it into a series of annual meetings, clean energy forums with really interesting, energetic music and artists and this energy of joy. And everybody came together from all walks of life who had never talked to each other before, including solar people and wind people never talked to each other in the same room before. The US and China people and many other countries in the same room before. The journalists and the teachers and the architects and all these people never come together before in one room. And we expressed the picture of a clean energy world, of a renewables powered world, of a blue sky world, a green grass world with such joy that everybody basically said, Peggy, you have to do more. Oops. You have to do more. You can't just stop there. You have to help us come together. And they didn't use these words, but we have to find our tribe. We have to come together. We need to create this tornado of change. And so the first step is really seeing the world as if you are already successful, telling the story, seeing the dream. The second one is being the eye of the tornado, being the eye of the tornado, and gathering all these particles of family members coming together, magnetized by your vision. And everybody is spinning and spinning around, reshaping the land, not incrementally landscaping, but like a tornado, completely reshaping the land. Radical change, not incremental change. And then letting go, believing that we will get there, and not being a slave to business plans or a controlled path or fear that we can only do so much one step at a time, but believing and letting go with the flow. And so in 2010, I dropped all business plans. I dropped all annual reports. I used my intuition and my experience. I used my heart. And I believed in the people that came to me at the time that they were supposed to come to me, to work together on reshaping the land with the force of a tornado. And we set off many tornadoes, and we were the eyes of many storms. So all you have to do is surrender to the fact that the dream will be, and not be a slave to the path or analyzing the scenarios or business plans or forecasts. That will only get you incremental change and not radical change. The other thing that we did right was to focus on acupuncture points. For those of you who know the meridian system, if you push on an acupuncture or acupressure point, a meridian, it affects the entire system. It's like a ripple effect. It's a butterfly effect. So I'll tell you one example of infrastructure change, and that's the smart grid. The smart grid is the backbone of all electrical delivery, and it's the on-ramp for renewables at scale. It's the necessity for energy efficiency. And so without smart grid, it's a little bit like rotary phones versus the internet, right? When we started to look at smart grid with this white paper, knocking on doors, grids, utilities, what we realized was there's only 2 grid companies across China. One of them covers 80% of the landmass. That's the China State Grid. What we didn't realize at the time was there's only one group within the China State Grid that looked at new technologies like smart grid. That's SEPRI. And because of the way China works, only certain people are allowed to talk to foreigners in English. And so there are 2 people in the department in the China State Grid that covers 80% of the grid of China. And so by doing a Clinton Global Initiative with Duke Energy's CEO and CTO and people who came on board, IBM's VP, Cisco's VP, the Department of Energy, and many, many more, and surrounding those two people with solutions and hope and joy and positivity and possibilities of the dream that we had pictured in this little picture on a white paper. 2.5 years later, that's how we got $7.2 billion compared to US at the time, $7.1 billion, $7.2 billion behind smart grid. That's how we got Jiang Zemin's hometown, Yangzhou, to host us in a conference, and then to create within 9 months, they set aside 200 mu, which I believe is 12 acres. I could be wrong, but you sort of get my picture. A new smart valley, the first ever demonstration park of smart grid in China. And that set off pilot cities, 12 pilot cities, then another 25 pilot cities for smart grid, which, as I said, has led to over 500 smart cities across China. That was actually a number of 2 years ago before COVID. I'm not sure, actually, I wasn't keeping track of time. So Melina, maybe you can somebody give me a time check?
Yeah, I did not exactly track when you started, but if you can finish up in 1 and 2 minutes, that would be great.
Okay. Well, I just want to tell you that with my story, you can set off the same tornadoes. You can believe in yourself. You can dream with joy. You can then magnetize people to this dream. And you don't need to know exactly how you're going to get there, but you will. When China's 5-year plan set aside KPIs, key performance indices, with targets, with numerical targets every 5 years, they don't know exactly how they're going to reach them, but they do, because they dream that they will. And then they magnetize all the local government and the companies and the individual citizens to all rally together to achieve these dreams. So with that, I wish everybody here the bravery, the courage, the knowledge, the remembrance that you can achieve all of these dreams, all of these radical changes. You can help change the world starting with today. Thank you very much to the forum for inviting me.
Excellent. Thank you very much for a story about love. I think that is wonderful to put it in those sort of broad and human terms. I feel that we can all relate to. So that was excellent. Thank you very much for being here. Well, thank you very much for all the panelists for your very interesting contributions. It's a shame that Nehmat Kaur felt a bit sick, so she isn't joining for the further discussion. And we don't have so much time for the further discussion. So I really urge the audience to ask your questions in the chat or in a separate Q&A, but in the chat, then everybody can see them, and then we can go straight away to the questions of the audience to address them. So actually, I would like to start with one of the last questions that came in. This was a question raised by Zaki Issa, and he asked, how do you think globalization can be used as a way of tackling climate change as opposed to just being a contribution to it? So I will unmute all the panelists so you can speak whenever you.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Zaki, for your question. I'm going to point to the Belt and Road as an example of globalization. This covers, the Belt and Road is basically goes from China to Russia to Nigeria to Spain, through boats, through high-speed rail, through cargo rail. And it's really through logistics. It's a way to create prosperity across all the neighboring countries. All boats rise together with the rising tide. And there's, you know, chimneys and pollution do not respect nation state borders. So we have to govern together in regions and collectively. This is something that is a must. And so with the Belt and Road, if you really look at all the announcements, all the MOUs coming out of the annual meetings of the Belt and Road, you will see a lot of cooperation that is not in the mass media about green development, about building legal capability, about scholarships. There's much more to dive into there, but this is going to reshape logistics, reshape prosperity, and it's really going to reshape the whole definition of globalization. And there's a lot of opportunity there to share technologies in these free trade zones, like, for example, rice that grows in saline water that came from China, or the organic catalyst that turns sand into arable soil. And I'm not going to even talk about the renewables, which is very obvious. So I'm going to stop there, but thank you for the question.
Okay, so any of the other panelists want to address that question? Yeah, please.
Let me also come in very quickly. I think that was a very good question. As you know, globalization has both merits and demerits. And of course, most of the times we tend to focus on the merits of globalization, and we do not look at the discontents of globalization, you know, in terms of inequality, in terms of how climate change could be affected, in terms of how diseases could spread, infectious diseases around the world, as we have seen with COVID-19. So basically, what is more important to do is really to have all kinds of regulations that can help us to manage globalization so that the benefits of globalization can be benefited, I mean, can accrue everywhere in the world. So that's very fundamental when you talk about globalization. And I think it's precisely because of this that world leaders adopted the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, because we live in a globalized world. It's how we are able to deal with the discontents of globalization so that we are able to promote prosperity for everyone and even for our planet that we all live in, and combat all kinds of negative effects of globalization, including climate change. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you so much. I think it would be very nice to move on to one of the other questions that was raised in the Q&A, and that is, in your experience, which projects or initiatives have you come across which you felt show reliable progress and real hope in terms of addressing development issues? So this is really a question, can you give us some hope? So what projects really had some impact that you, from a personal perspective, really felt like this really made a difference in terms of development output?
I can actually address that question. I would be very happy to address. I think every project and every program has a development impact. And I personally have come across with all projects that have already a sustainable development impact. And I will talk maybe for an example in Suriname with a health project, health project, the building, the construction of the hospital, the main hospital in the country. And that personally has made me think that actually, yes, development is actually a reality. And it can take many forms, as I mentioned during my presentation. And there are actually also many sectors. So not only the healthcare, but also we're talking about the energy, we can talk about the agriculture. So there are many examples. I think, as I said, every project has a development impact, and I can mention many. Nicaragua, with the food security and women empowerment, there was no gender issue, no legislation in one of the towns in the country, and we financed this gender issue, and we promoted climate change initiatives and also cooperatives in the town. So yes, I think every project and program has a development impact.
Thank you very much. And so one of the questions that came in the chat is, so how do you really measure the impact that you have with your development projects? How do you know they have impact, and how are you able to measure?
Let me take that.
Yeah.
There are different ways of measuring impacts of development projects in particular. And of course, depending on the goal, on the objective of such development projects, first of all and foremost, you have to come up with a theory of change of what you are trying to do. The theory of change will be the inputs and how they lead you to the outputs, the outcomes, and then the overall impact. And in terms of doing that, let's say, for instance, you are looking at a specific development project in a particular village, and you want to see how that project has, say, alleviated poverty. You can use what you call double difference methodology or difference in difference methodology, whereby you have the control group, then you have the comparison group, then you look at both groups, over time, before and after the project intervention. Of course, in selecting such groups, they must have similar characteristics, except that one group benefited from a particular development project and the other does not benefit. And then you compare them over time, and then you can do some analysis and you come up with some of the impacts in terms of, it could be in terms of poverty reduction, it could be in terms of environmental sustainability, it could be in terms of food security, depending on the objectives and the goals for which you are measuring them. But of course, there are many, 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 many measures of looking at the impact of development projects. So it all depends on the objectives that you have in mind. Thank you.
I'm going to jump in and answer. There's many questions about what are examples of, real examples that make an impact. So I'm going to list a few, but I do recommend that everybody goes to the website drawdown.org for a list of interventions that can reverse climate change, drawdown.org. Also, when I was working as an advisor to the EAT Forum, which is the largest platform for food systems transformation, the former special envoy to the UN SDGs, the global goals, said many times that food education is the single intervention that helps achieve all 17 global goals. If you're going to do one thing cost effectively, please educate kids especially and their parents to eat in a way that's not just good for their bodies, but good for the planet, to reduce food waste and to eat a plant-rich diet. I cannot emphasize enough how that is a massive acupressure point for change. Soil sequestration is something that hopefully many of you are already aware of. But replanting trees, China is the leading country in replanting trees. Take a look at the Loess Plateau example with the World Bank. World Bank spent 10 years to help the region the size of Belgium, and now it's the size of France. They turned it from desert to permaculture. And this is very well documented case study. And as I said, turning desert sand into arable soil is something that China has succeeded in doing. So in the Gobi Desert, they're planting potatoes and much more. There are many, many different examples. Hopefully I've given you some examples in my speech. If you want more to dive into, again, the McKinsey interventions for energy efficiency that was launched back in 2007 is still relevant. The waterfall chart of which interventions are the biggest acupressure points, which led us to lighting, switching out the lighting, and many other things. You should take a look at that particular report. So there's many points of hope. Somebody asked about fast fashion. For me, that isn't necessarily something that has huge impact on emissions as much as pollution, right? So they're together, obviously both harmful for the environment, but they're slightly different. So I guess it depends on what we're emphasizing here. I did work with the Caring Group. I will say, please take a look at the Caring Group. They launched an app to help teach young designers what were the biggest impacts on the environment. So depending on what materials they chose, where they chose to manufacture something, in what way they made a particular purse or garment, how it affected emissions. And it's the Kering group, K-E-R-I-N-G. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you very much. And thank you so much for all the questions that are coming in. So let's move on to the next question. So what are the best first steps a private company can take to align their business in terms of the sustainable development goals and make this transition to sustainability successful? So what are the best steps that a private company can take to align their business in terms of the SDGs? If there's any one of you who wants to answer, otherwise we can move on to another question.
I think it really depends on the sector. It really depends on the type of industry. And a lot has to deal with the human capital, because we sometimes think that it's only about the product, it's only about the organization itself, the mission, vision, but we don't focus on the human capital. If we don't invest in knowledge, in trainings, in the people, I mean, if they're going to be motivated towards coming with innovative solutions and working together. So teamwork is actually another solution to enable creativity, to enable innovation, and to enable actually the sustainability solutions. So I think it's a lot on human capital, I would say. And SMEs and small companies and startups actually have are key for these processes around the world, I would say, not only in a specific region, but around the world.
Excellent, thank you very much. So I think it's time to address the elephant in the room. So that's the question, is green growth even possible, or should we move to post-growth society?
Is green, sorry, I don't understand the difference.
So is it even possible to have sort of to have a climate neutral world with our capitalist system, in which we keep on sort of growing economically? Is economic growth even compatible with a sustainable climate?
Oh, I see. Well, I should have started my talk by reminding people, if you didn't know already, that China has committed to carbon neutrality by 2060. And it's going to peak emissions before its Paris Agreement commitment of 2030. And so the question of, can you have green growth with capitalism? China believes yes. And China is going to be the largest economy in the entire world very shortly. Now it is evolving its system. So we're going towards a digital currency with the People's Bank of China. It basically removed all cash, paper cash. So it's a digital cashless society right now. It's going towards the sharing economy. You see this with the shared bikes, the electric shareable cars, the self-driving taxis. We now have moving towards efficiency. For example, I mean, this is a really strange example of efficiency, but we now have a restaurant of 600 seats where everything is robots. The logistics for the food is robots. The prepping of the food is robots. The cooking of the food is robots. The ordering is robots. The delivery of the food and the cleanup is by robots. And so, of course, this has a remarkable impact on the labor and the requirements for education, retraining the skilled labor. However, it is a step towards efficiency. So the key is to rethink like nature. You know, Taoism says that we must remember we are nature. We cannot be above nature or outside nature. So as long as we remember that every part of nature can be reborn, e.g. circular economy, and all of our governance systems takes into account the fact that change, birth and death, recycling is the only constant. We cannot keep things on a path or hoard assets. We need to share, right? We need to remember that we need to move because things will happen, disasters will happen. We need to be nimble. We need mobility. We need resilience. If we remember that we are nature, we're not outside of nature, then yes, we can have green growth, but it's really not growth. It's just green transition, green continuation.
Thank you very much. Any one of the other panelists who want to respond to that question? So is economic please.
Let me also respond to that. I believe that green growth is possible, is doable, is achievable, and that's why the whole idea of integration of the linkages between the economy and the environment are very important. And of course, they are manifold. On the one hand, why the environment, provide the kind of resources that the economy requires, it also acts as a sink, for all kinds of emissions, waste, and the rest of them. But of course, as you know, what is really important is the way, the manner in which processes and programs are implemented in different places that can help us, to look at the kind of benefit that we can get from the linkages between the economy and environment. So I believe, for me, we have not done enough analysis of all of these things to really look at the net benefit, the net cost to the society. And that, of course, has been subject of a lot of debate. Heated arguments have come out of that. But overall, green growth is possible, is doable, and it's achievable. We just have to make sure that we look at all the ramifications involved and how things are implemented around the world. And I think that's why the idea of the how the economy can affect the environment and how the environment can affect the economy comes in, and then we have to factor in the benefit, or the cost to the society. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Natalia. If you want, you have the last word.
Yeah, I think I would actually agree with Dr. Omilola on the fact that, yes, the green growth is a reality. It's not a myth, it's actually a possibility. It's not based on different regions or countries, but it will really depend on the agenda of a public agenda, of the government's agenda, but also on the role of the private sector, and why not the citizens. I think regardless of our position, I think each one of us can also contribute somehow to this whole process. So with that, I will end.
Well, I'm happy that we end on a very positive note, and I think most of the things that we heard tonight were quite positive and promising. So that is really great to see, because these are such important issues. So I would really like to thank the organization, the amazing panelists, and also the amazing audience for all your great questions. So that was great that you were all here and you really made this into a successful discussion. So thank you very much, and I hope that you will all attend the following days that also promise very interesting discussions on development in the London Development Symposium. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. All right, bye now.
Bye-bye. Enjoy Abidjan.